Narset's static ability is secretly broken, and this video will prove it. I found this list browsing Twitter, so a big thanks to George Jabor for the deck. Using this list, we'll cast Narset alongside Days Undoing as a 2-card combo to wipe all but one card in our opponent's hand. If we have Teferi Time Raveler, we can even cast it in their draw step, so they will have 0. To support this combo, we are playing no counterspell, but a ton of free spells. 4 Solitude, 4 Subtlety, and 3 Force of Negation. At first, this may sound crazy, but this video will prove George's deck building to be brilliant. As always, if you like this type of content, then please like and subscribe, and please drop a comment to support the channel. To start off game 1, we have to reveal our companion, mulligan our opening 7. Being on the draw, I don't mind keeping this and not going to 5, I just don't want to see a Ragavan. I'm feeling good from our opponent playing land and saying go, and top decking a Narset is nice to go alongside the Days Undoing. Our opponent fetches a Triumph and plays a Kroxa, which is extremely slow and exactly what we need with this hand. Discard a bad land and untap. As I'm fetching this land, I want to point out that my opponent said good luck, have fun at the start of the match, and I did not reply. This is because they gave me good luck and I did not return it, so I'm bound to be more lucky than them. We play a Hollowed Fountain and hope that they miss their land drop, get mana screwed, and have nothing to cast. Oh, god damn it. I decide to discard Jace the Mind Sculptor here, as we have 2 non-creature spells coming from the Narset, and we need mana to cast these spells. So I'm getting rid of the Jace, keeping the lands as I want to hit all of my land drops. With the Prismatic Ending off the top, we have a lot of options. You can play Narset and minus, you can Prismatic Ending the Lily, but what we're actually going to do is play Narset and do nothing. This plays around Lightning Bolt, Bloodbraid Elf, and gives us the best chance to Days Undoing next turn. Our opponent pluses Liliana the Veil and passes the turn? Okay. With a Teferi off the top, let's Days Undoing. As it ends the turn, after it resolves, they have to Lightning Bolt the Narset in response, and we get to draw a nice 7. Wait, what? 6 lands and a Chalice? Are you kidding me? This Days Undoing was actually quite bad for us. With an upticking Lily Veil and a Wrenn and 6, they can easily come back in this game if we don't find anything. With the Days Undoing off the top, it's not great to cast it as it does end the turn, so let's use Narset. Luckily, we find Prismatic Ending, which easily answers the Lily Veil. This also lets us play Chalice of the Void on 1, and we have Hall of Storm Giants on later turns to kill Wrenn. Our opponent has a load of fetching shenanigans, which is essentially nothing this late into the game, and we top deck a Prismatic Ending, which lets us get rid of the Wrenn and 6. We play our creature land and pass back. Our opponent does nothing again, and we top deck a Narset Parter of Veils. This is a great draw here, as we have the Gaia Reach Sanitarium, which allows us to pay 2 mana to loot. This means that the opponent will discard a card, and we draw a card and discard a card because of Narset. There isn't much left to this game, as we have the Sanitarium and the Narset and a load of cards coming, so just watch what happens. Sideboarding is different to typical blue-white control, as we're looking to protect our planeswalkers and stop them from removing them. That's why we're taking out Chalice and Dress Down, and we want the Shark Typhoons. As they're playing discard spells, we have to keep any distribution of lands and spells, which is what we do here, and it's nice because we have Solitude and Force for key threats. That's a Ragavan. At least we have the Solitude. With the Jace off the top, our hand is Force, and we do have to use the Solitude on the Ragavan so that they don't run away with the game. Our opponent has a good follow-up in Wrenn and 6, which I don't want to counter, as I do want to have some cards in hand and don't want to pitch everything. Super awkward spot, we do need something off the top of the deck here to... Ooh! I thank the magic gods as I cast this Prismatic Ending for 2 on the Wrenn and 6. The opponent follows up with a Tarmogoyf and passes back. We top deck a Subtlety, play our land, and say go. Our opponent gets in for 3, casts another Tarmogoyf, plays a tap land, and ships it back. I decide not to Dress Down as I want to be patient with it. We top deck our 4th land, but it's not looking good for us, as there's a lot of pressure on the board and we have no good way to get card advantage. Gonna pass back here and hope to do something with this Subtlety. Things really start to go south when a Thoughtseize is put on the stack and we are forced to Dress Down to draw a card and also make these Tarmogoyfs a lot smaller. Jace the Mind Sculptor is discarded, they have no attacks and no spells, and they pass back. Unfortunately, we draw another land. With an attack for 10, we flash in Subtlety on their end step, as we most likely will have to chump block next turn and need to draw something powerful. As I'm asking the magic gods for 1 time, we hit Teferi Time Raveler, bounce the Goyf, chump the other one, and we actually have Force of Negation up for any removal spell. A Lightning Bolt is put on the stack, so we do have to use Force of Negation and go to a low life total. Apart from that, we bounce the Goyf and find another Force of Negation. We chump block the attacking Goyf and they make a very confusing play. They cast Engineered Explosives, X is 3. This now leaves us open to top decking Prismatic Ending, Solitude, another Teferi Time Raveler. We have a load of outs. Supreme Verdict off the top, that's when we needed a removal spell. Let's plus our Teferi Time Raveler and cast it in their turn. Our opponent gets in, we have to Verdict as it's a lethal threat and they cast the other Goyf. We need to top deck. Again, the opponent made a fatal punt saying good luck, have fun, as we find the Narset. The Engineered Explosives is annoying, but hopefully this will help us find a removal spell. We cast the Narset and have to take another Teferi Time Raveler as the Tarmogoyf is lethal. We play the Tef, bounce the Tarmogoyf, and they sacrifice the Engineered Explosives, finding us a Day's Undoing. Not great, but at least it does something. The opponent untaps, recasts the Tarmogoyf, and ships the turn back to us. With another Day's Undoing off the top of the deck, we have two options. We can cast Day's Undoing, or we can use our companion Kahira to chump block to give us another draw step. I go with the Kahira line as I believe giving them 7 cards is just not going to win the game. Our opponent dashes Ragavan, gets in, and we're forced to chump block the Tarmogoyf again. It's unfortunate that they exile a Solitude off the top of our deck, as that's a card that we really need. The Ragavan bounces to their hand, and we take a draw step. With a Prismatic Ending off the top, we can get rid of the Tarmogoyf and Day's Undoing and hope to draw spells. Any Lightning Bolt, any Renin 6, any Dash Ragavan puts us in a terrible spot. There's an Inquisition of Kozilek. That takes our Teferi Time Raveler, and they have a Collective Brutality to kill us. On to Game 3. For Game 3, we mulligan a bad opening 7 and keep a decent 6, and also I put in a Dovin's Veto and took out a Force of Negation for this third game. I bottom the Plains, play the Flooded Strand, and they don't have a Ragavan. With the Force of Negation off the top, we can play our land and say go. They put a Tarmogoyf on the stack, which I do want a Subtlety so that this board will be clear for the Narset. We top deck a Verdict, cast the Narset, and we have an interesting decision. We can take a Planeswalker or a land. I do take the Seagate Restoration as I do want to have access to Supreme Verdict next turn, and we can get another non-creature spell with the Narset. Our opponent has a tapped Blood Crypt and a Turak. We draw a Solitude for turn, minus our Narset, and find a Shark Typhoon. It's important to note that Shark Typhoon is discarded to cycling, which pumps Turak. So it's not as clear cut as cycling the Shark Typhoon for 1 and blocking. I would have to shock with the Seagate Restoration to block. I do go with the shock line, less of blocking and more that I want to be able to pressure a Planeswalker if they do have one. Our opponent plays land, plays Renin 6, and pings our Narset, and then they decide not to attack. We need to use our mana, so I decide to cycle the Shark Typhoon for 2. While it does pump the Turak, it does put pressure on the Ren. We draw another Shark Typhoon, kill the Renin 6, play our land, and say go. Our opponent follows up with a good Liliana the Veil, so we discard one of our Solitudes, they attack in with their creature, and say go. There's no question here but to cycle the Shark, and sadly they have the removal spell. Lightning Bolt kills our Shark Typhoon, and we draw Plains from the draw. We then draw a Dress Down for our draw step. First we attack the Liliana for 2, and then I think for over 2 minutes here for what the play is. I go with put Kahira into hand and still hold up Dress Down, as I think that we can wait one more turn before casting Supreme Verdict. This is getting tense, but the opponent untaps, pluses the Lily, and we bin the Kahira. Turak gets pumped by 1 counter, and they cast another kicked Turak. But don't forget we have the Dress Down, so we cast the Dress Down, preventing the kicked ability. We draw a Day's Undoing, they have to sacrifice one of the Turaks because of the legend rule, and they get in for 6. Dress Down sacrifices, and we draw a Teferi Time Raveler. We hit the Liliana for 2, and we have no other option than to cast the Supreme Verdict. Our opponent leads on Thoughtseize, which I think is a missequence, as you should plus Lily first and then cast Thoughtseize, but after this they then cast an Engineered Explosives on 3. With a blank off the top, we have to Teferi Time Raveler and bounce the Engineered Explosives, finding a Day's Undoing off the top. Let's pass, discard the land, and see what we can do on the next turn. Ooh, Raging Ravine, that is a great threat here that fights against all of our sorcery speed removal. The Engineered Explosives comes back down, and we top deck a Prismatic Ending. We plus our Teferi Time Raveler, we Prismatic Ending the Liliana the Veil for 3, and we pass the turn. Our opponent animates Raging Ravine, but for some reason attacks the Teferi Time Raveler. I don't know why. With the Teferi Time Raveler plus, I believe that it is safe to cast Day's Undoing here as we can find so many free spells. I decide to untap rather than Solitude the Raging Ravine now, because if they want to animate the Raging Ravine again, that would cost 4 mana, which is technically a Time Walk. I lead the turn with Narset to see what we are working with, and we find a Force of Negation. I think what's suitable here is to Prismatic Ending the Engineered Explosives, play our land, and pass the turn. Our opponent leads with a Mountain and a Dashed Ragavan. I really don't want my life total to go any lower against the Lightning Bolt deck, so I decide to Solitude it. Our opponent follows up with the Liliana of the Veil, which we have a Dovin's Veto for. We untap, draw Prismatic Ending, and we activate our Narset. Here we can either choose between a Teferi Time Raveler or a Days Undoing. I think it's clear, let's Days Undoing with Force of Negation backup, and if they have the Lightning Bolt, we can just counter it. We cast the Days Undoing, they have the Lightning Bolt, so we have to Force of Negation. Now we need to draw a Solitude. With a Solitude and a white spell, we can now exile the Raging Ravine. This was very lucky. In hindsight, maybe we should have just held back with Force of Negation and Otawara, but we drew the right spell, so I guess it was correct. Our opponent animates the Raging Ravine, we have the Solitude, and they are actually locked out of the game here when they cast the Tarmogoyf. With Gaia Reach Sanitarium and Otawara, we can bounce the Tarmogoyf, make them discard it, we can Subtlety the Tarmogoyf, and then they are locked out of the game. Because of the combo between Narset and Gaia Reach Sanitarium, they will never draw another card, because we can force them to loot on their upkeep, and then they skip their draw step. There is a line for them to win with Kroxa, but I'm pretty sure we can find a counterspell for that before the Kroxa is even turned online and put in the graveyard. Round 2, we're on the play. Let's reveal our Kahira, and we have to mulligan this no land 7, and we have to mulligan this terrible 6. Well, let's keep this 5, it's not looking great, but maybe we can do something with Days Undoing? Let's lead with a tap breeding pool, see what they're playing. Ah, it's 4-color control. Nice. Typical things happen, we both hit our land drops, and we're put into a very interesting spot on turn 3. Do we cast the Days Undoing? Well, they have 7 cards in hand. I have 4. If I cast it, it's technically a card draw, so fuck it. Sadly, 4-color does 4-color things, and they do have the counterspell. Oh, it's an Ice Fang Codal. Well, if they do have the Force of Negation, we are screwed, so I'm just going to Solitude this and hope that they don't have it, so that we draw even more cards. Days Undoing resolves, we find a Subtlety and a Force of Negation and a Dress Down, which is exactly what we need in this matchup, alongside Narset and Jace the Mind Sculptor. Who couldn't ask for more? The opponent does have the Teferi Time Raveler, but we've got the Force of Negation. Let's get rid of the Dress Down, untap, and get this Jace the Mind Sculptor on the table. This plays around Prismatic Ending nicely. We've got 2 Prismatic Vistas, let's get a basic island, cast our Jace and Brainstorm. It's unfortunate to find 2 lands, but we've got multiple fetch lands to shuffle them away on later turns, and with a Subtlety, it's easy to protect the Jace. Our opponent just does the 4-color Dirtle, and we get to untap. I have an interesting decision between Teferi and Narset. I'm going to go for Teferi as Risen Reef is not drawing cards, it's putting cards from the top of the library into hand or into play, and it costs a lot of mana to put it back on the table again, and we Brainstorm into a lot of lands. But again, I'm not too concerned as we have the fetch lands to shuffle them away. However, the opponent continues to do the 4-color Dirtle. I'm just going to fast forward through this as I'm sure it's not very interesting to watch. We Brainstorm into Supreme Verdict and Prismatic Ending, and I decide not to cast the Verdict as I'm saving it for an Omnath. Here, I'd rather cast the Narset. We've plus the Teferi, so we can Prismatic Ending one of the attackers to make it awkward to kill our Planeswalkers, and then we have a Narset on the table and a Subtlety backup. With the Lightning Bolt on the Teferi, I don't need to Prismatic Ending anymore, as I want to save that for a more relevant threat, and we can just use the Verdict down the line. So let's untap, use all of our Planeswalkers, and keep up Subtlety again. With a Teferi Time Raveler off the top, we have a load of decisions, especially from this Brainstorm. Maybe we could have plussed the Jace to give it more protection from another Lightning Bolt, but I think that they would have bolted the Jace if they had a second. You can cast Chalice of the Void on one, but I definitely want to lead with Teferi first. For mana efficiency reasons, I think it's sensible to plus the Teferi and go for the Supreme Verdict and have Subtlety for their Teferi. After the Subtlety resolves, they do nothing and pass back. We've got so many Planeswalkers that there's no way we can lose this game, right? We Brainstorm, tuck back the Prismatic Ending in the land, play our land, play the Chalice on one, start casting all of our Planeswalkers, and tap out because we know that they have a Teferi coming down soon. Now don't forget, we do have a lot of Days Undoings left in the deck, As soon as we find one, this game is going to be over as we just dump all of the cards out of their hand. Teferi Time Raveler comes down on the table, but confusingly they plus it instead of bouncing their own Oath of Nissa. They then have a Wrenn 6, which I'm not too worried about. With passing of the turn, a land on the top, and then 4 more lands from the Narset, we Prismatic Ending the Teferi Time Raveler, and then start activating our Planeswalkers. They have another Wrenn 6, which kills our Narset, and then they Endurance, shuffling their graveyard back into their library. To me, something that makes almost no sense, as they not only have a Triome in their graveyard, but they're building towards Delirium, and they have a Wrenn 6 in play. I don't know. Okay, let's bounce the Endurance back to their hand, start activating our Planeswalkers, drawing a load of cards, and pulling away with the game. On our end step, they do have an Otawara, which bounces our Teferi to our hand, and they can return it to their hand with Wrenn 6, which I guess justifies the Endurance play, I guess? I don't know. They do also have an Omnath to go alongside this, but we have double Subtlety, Force of Negation, and Solitude. It's never resolving. I want to take the aggressive plan and get rid of this Wrenn 6, so I do play the other Subtlety to play around Otawara, and we can cast the Teferi Time Raveler to make the Endurance awkward to block. The opponent decides not to bounce any of my creatures, the Wrenn 6 dies, and we go for the Teferi Time Raveler, which we will plus and say go. We have so much interaction up now that it's going to be very hard to actually disrupt us. Well, that's if you don't have an Omnath Locus of Creation in your hand. That's going to be awkward. That resolves. Oh wait, we have a Solitude. Our opponent has a Prismatic Ending, but shockingly we have a Force of Negation after all of those brainstorms. Let's get rid of the Days Undoing, untap, attack, and then we can bounce a Subtlety to our hand so that we have extra protection after this brainstorm. This is going to be very hard for them to win. They're almost 0%. Boarding in this matchup, we want all the Shark Typhoons, the Emrakul, and the Dress Down, and I take out the Clunky Chalices, the Verdicts, and a Days Undoing. You could also board a Mystical Dispute, but I couldn't find room. And I also want to point out that this is 4-color elementals, not 4-color control, so they play things like Cavern of Souls. Anyways, we keep a nice 7 here on the draw, and the opponent mulligans to 4. Yes, 4 cards. Well, for a mulligan to 4, they do hit their early land drops, and they do have a Risen Reef, which is really good for them. I decide to cycle the Shark Typhoon for 0 to find a bit more interaction, and we find a land, and our draw step finds another land. Being a bit nervous about Omnath, I decide to go for Narset, but like any reasonable mulligan to 4 from 4-color control, they do have the Force of Negation, and a land for turn. Why not? They attack, we untap, find another land, so I decide to go for Jace the Mind Sculptor. Our Brainstorm isn't too great, but if they have a premium non-creature spell, then we can use Force of Negation. But as any normal 4-color controlled draw, on a mulligan to 4, they have the Omnath. It's really fortunate that they didn't hit a land from Risen Reef, as then they would have had mana, and if they had a fetch land, they could have even killed the Jace the Mind Sculptor, but we do untap, and we have a lot of options. I'm really not sure if I made the right play here, but I do go for Teferi Time Raveler, holding up Subtlety on the Omnath. Again, I'm not too sure if I like it. Subtlety puts Omnath on top of the deck, they attack our Teferi Time Raveler for 1, and it dies. We then draw our land, and get to Brainstorm again. Finding a Solitude is perfect here, as that's an answer to the Omnath, so let's put back 2 duds and say go. Our opponent attacks Jace for 1, they have the Omnath again, we have the Solitude with the Force of Negation backup, and they get 2 triggers. We find a Flooded Strand, which is perfect as we can now Prismatic Ending the Risen Reef, and we find a second Prismatic Ending off the top, so let's shuffle these 2 dud lands away, get the Breeding Pool, Prismatic Ending the Risen Reef, attack for 3, and say go. They have an Icefang Codal on our end step, but we can cycle Shark Typhoon to block it. The opponent untaps, attacks the Jace, we have to cycle the Shark and we block. They have the Teferi Time Raveler, we have the Force of Negation, so it's not too much of a problem. Nope, it is a problem, because not only do they have Flusterstorm, they also have Lightning Bolt. Don't forget, this all started from a mulligan to 4, this deck is insane. We start the turn by attacking Teferi Time Raveler, but they have the Icefang Codal to chump block. Fortunately, we have the Prismatic Ending. The opponent then has an Omnath, we have the Dress Down, we top deck a Prismatic Ending, and they continue to durdle. We have Solitude and Hall of Storm Giants on the board, so we do have a presented blocker. As well, we can cycle Shark Typhoon to block the Omnath if we choose. So we pass the turn. The opponent has Prismatic Ending X's 5 on our Solitude. That's funny. But with no follow-up, they can't attack because of the Hall of the Storm Giants, and now we can cycle Shark Typhoon to make a massive attacker. With Solitude off the top and Subtlety in hand, it's very hard for our opponent to resolve a spell, so I'm going to attack, pass the turn, and attempt to Solitude their Omnath when it becomes relevant, or use the Subtlety and Force of Negation to disrupt their plan more. Don't forget, they had a load of mana last turn, and the best thing they could do was Prismatic Ending for 5. With Subtlety putting Risen Reef on top, we can bash in and then Solitude on their upkeep with Force of Negation backup and hope they have nothing. Ah yes, they have Risen Reef and Omnath. Great. Oath of Nissa finds a good Teferi Time Raveler, but we have the Force of Negation. We untap, top deck a Narset, so let's activate it. We find a Prismatic Ending, so let's exile the Risen Reef and bash in for more damage. Our opponent has another Risen Reef, and we know that they have the Teferi Time Raveler in hand, so this is getting awkward. We let the Wrenn and 6 resolve, they get the Omnath mana, they cast a Teferi, so we have to Force of Negation, and they have the Flusterstorm. Teferi hits the table. This is going to get extremely awkward for us. They can bounce the token, they can bounce whatever they like, they have the Omnath, they have so many lands coming into play, they're gaining a load of life. We're definitely going to have to go to a game 3 here. This is looking hopeless for us. Yeah, this is just not looking good. Emrakul off the top! Come on! Look at that, we can wipe their whole board to Teferi Time Raveler, Wrenn and 6 ping. So I think it's suitable here to attack Wrenn and 6 for 3 damage, leaving it on 1, allowing me to ping something. We can cast the Emrakul, the Omnath can attack into the Emrakul, we could do whatever we like. 13-13 on the table, they have a Prismatic Ending in their hand. They draw an Oath of Nissa for turn. I definitely like using the Oath of Nissa here, as you can choose to not put a card into your hand. You can Prismatic Ending one of the Oath of Nissa or the Abundant Growth, and from the Oath of Nissa we hit a Fury. So I decide here to Fury, deal 3 damage to itself, 1 damage to the Risen Reef. We do get a Risen Reef trigger, but we can just use that card as well. We can then Wrenn and 6 ping the Teferi Time Raveler, use the Omnath to attack into the Emrakul, and we hit a Wrenn and 6 from the Fury trigger, so we can cast that new one and ping itself. As always, if you did enjoy this video, then please like and subscribe and drop a comment as it really does support the channel. I know that this was only a 2-match video, but these 2 matches were 2 hours combined, so this took me over 6 hours to edit. The rest of the league I finished 4-1, but it just wasn't worth it. I'd rather put these 2 amazing matches in for you so that you could see them. But that's about it. Check out this video because YouTube thinks you'll like it. Peace.